Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, body positivity, and health at every size. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified intuitive eating counselor specializing in weight-inclusive wellness. Join me as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beef, and now I'm ready for the world, trying to sink my teeth in, stacking it.
Hey there, welcome to episode 104 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Anita Johnston, the amazing author of Eating in the Light of the Moon and a psychotherapist who's been treating eating disorders for over 3 decades. She is such an amazing person. Her gift for storytelling and metaphor is just unparalleled, and her book has really touched many people. I know we had some discussion about it recently in the Food Psych listener Facebook group, and so many people were like, yeah, that book changed my life. So I'm so honored and happy to be talking with Anita today. We got into why highly sensitive people are often vulnerable to disordered eating and eating disorders, what we can do to cultivate that sensitive side of ourselves and allow it to have more room to grow, why we also need boundaries and sort of a more logical energy in our lives sometimes, and a whole lot more. It was such a good conversation. We really packed a lot into a short time, so I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. Before I do, I just want to share a couple of great resources for helping you improve your relationship with food. The first is my free audio guide, which is 7 simple strategies for finding peace and freedom with food. And this is like my quick start guide to intuitive eating and health at every size. So if you're looking for some practical tips to launch your anti-diet journey, this is the place to go. Head over to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it, or you can also text the phone number 44222 with the word food psych, all one word. That's the phone number 44222 and text the word food psych. The second resource I want to share is my intuitive eating online course, which you can find at christyharrison.com/course. You've heard me talk a lot about it on the podcast, so I won't go into a long, in-depth thing about it now, but just know that it's there for you if you want some help and support on your journey toward intuitive eating. And if you've tried intuitive eating on your own and it hasn't been working, definitely check out this course because it really helps provide some troubleshooting and guidance in a lot of the areas people tend to get stuck. And I've been doing this work for years now and worked with hundreds of clients to help them make peace with food and implement the principles of intuitive eating in their lives. And I've seen consistently people getting stuck around the same kind of areas, a lot having to do with a diet mentality and health at every size principles, really being able to put body acceptance into action. So this course has all of that baked right into the course. We address size acceptance and rejecting the diet mentality all throughout the course. So you're really supported in that arena. And you also get access to a private Facebook group with other participants who are going through the journey just like you. So check it out at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Finally, if you like the podcast and you want to help us reach more people who need to hear the health at every size message, you can leave us a great review on iTunes. Just open up iTunes on your computer or the podcast app on your phone, type in Food Psych to the search bar, click on the result that comes up under podcasts, and then click on the ratings and reviews tab, and you can leave your rating and review there. It always really makes my day to read nice reviews of the podcast and hear how it's helping people. So I really appreciate everyone who's left reviews so far. Know that it means a lot to me. And if you want to add your name, go to iTunes and do that now. All right, without any further ado, let's go talk to Anita Johnston. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Well, I think I had a very unusual relationship with food, considering what things are like now. Mind you, I grew up on the island of Guam in the 50s and 60s. And so it was a very different culture than the culture that we're living in now. And honestly, I don't know of anybody that was dieting. So I wasn't sure if there was something wrong with my memory. So I had recently gotten together with my good friend, and we were best friends back when we were 13. And I said, I'm really trying to remember. Do you remember, were our moms dieting? Was that happening? She said, no, nobody dieted. Nobody talked about dieting. So I think, I look at that now and think, wow, that is just the strangest thing ever, because nowadays it's even hard to imagine. And that's why I thought my memory wasn't correct. So that was very different. And food was treated pretty much, I don't want to say a non issue, but I came from a very large family. There were 7 children. And the way the community was that I grew up in, it was the norm to have friends come over for dinner all the time without even telling your parents. I look back at that, having been a mom and go, oh my God, I would have shot my kids. But that's how it was. And so there could be 20 people for dinner, or there could be 5.
Wow.
My mother just took it in stride because there was always a pot of something on the stove, a pot of rice, because this is Guam and that was the staple. And so with my siblings and I, because there were so many of us, we were on very different schedules with activities after school. So we did not all sit down, the whole family around the table every night. It varied. Who happened to be home would sit down at the table and they would eat and catch up on their day. And so it's really, really different. It's certainly different from the way I raised my family. And I don't even think that's being done, certainly not in America these days.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of fending for oneself around food.
Mm-hmm.
That's so interesting. What do you think it was that protected against diet culture in your community?
Well, it wasn't around. People weren't so concerned about what they looked like back then in a way. First of all, this is the 50s and 60s. So, Twiggy had not come on board yet. That thin ideal certainly wasn't around. But it was a different culture. It was a very multicultural environment, and activities centered around just getting together. It actually did center around food a lot. So every village on the island had its own fiesta every year. And your popularity was determined by how much food and drink you could give away at your fiesta. So
Wow.
it wasn't like what kind of car you had or what kind of clothes you wore or how much money you had in the bank, but it was like, well, how popular are you? Because that's how you would know, is you would get the most people coming to your home when your village was having that fiesta.
Wow. So
Different,
that was,
huh?
yeah, very different. The status
Mhm.
symbols were different, but still there.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's amazing to grow up in a community completely free of diet culture. I'm sure that helped you develop a pretty intuitive relationship with food.
I think that is the only reason I can think of that I didn't have an eating disorder, because I have the personality, and I used to wonder why didn't I? And I think that's really it. It wasn't a thing. Now, that being said, that was my generation. That was not the case many years later. I have a younger sibling that had an eating disorder, because by that time, the thin ideal had already moved into the picture, at least somewhat.
And that's such a huge trigger for people, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you sort of made it out before that
I
happened.
did. I guess I just picked the right time and place to be born.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. But did that change when you left home or?
No, not really. I didn't leave home till I was a junior in college. So I went from Guam to Colorado. That was kind of wild. I'd never seen, mountain, snow, freeways, buses. It was. So I wasn't even back then. So this is the very early 70s, and dieting wasn't on my radar at that time. By the time I hit graduate school, yes, I knew friends that were doing it, but not then.
Mm. I read that you were in the Miss Universe pageant.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Okay. Well, that's interesting, because it was, first of all, it was not something I would ever have done. It had been decided probably when I was around 5 years old. I came from a family that was very active in the community. During World War II, the Japanese occupied the island for 3 years, and a lot of people suffered terribly and were tortured. And my grandmother led the underground resistance, and she had been tortured for that. And then after the war was over, she started the first high school, the first Girl Scouts, the first Red Cross. If there was something that needed to be done, she did it. And she would say, Anita, we're not here on this planet just to take up space. So I just kind of grew up with that attitude. And so we all were designated our service. And because I was pretty outgoing and probably pretty charming as a child, it was decided that when I grew up, I was going to be Miss Guam. And I was going to represent the island because back then, Guam was a joke on the Johnny Carson show, and people would refer to them as our little brown brothers in the Pacific. And
Mm.
so my assignment from the time I was quite little is when I was old enough, I was going to go become Miss Guam, and I was going to Washington, D.C., and I was going to show how articulate we are and shift things. And in those days, the only way to do that for a 18-year-old was through a beauty contest. So when the time came, I was none too thrilled about it. Mind you, Haight Ashbury was happening in San Francisco. And I'm going, oh, no, no, no. I think that's where I want to go. And then I was reminded, no. I graduated from high school fairly young. And so it was, no, you have to stay here till you're 18 so that you can become Miss Guam and do the deal. And by then I was becoming a feminist. All of this stuff was happening for me. And I'm going, oh, you've got to be kidding. And yet at the same time, I honored my culture. I understood this was a service that it was something I needed to do. And I was going to do it and be done with it. And then I was out of there. I didn't expect to win. That was not in my plan. Then there was this, just the insanity of, having to wear a bathing suit in high heels and with a sash, and they wanted me to wear false eyelashes and gain weight. Though interestingly enough, see, this is the 1960s still, and I was just an active person. I swam in the ocean. I mean, I never thought anything of it, and so it was again. You see how different the world is that I grew up in. It's not all like what we experience today.
And so interesting, there was still a beauty ideal for women, but it was different than the thin ideal.
Yes, it was the hourglass look. And there was the thing with the big hair and the heavy makeup and small waist, big breast. I remember that. And that did not, I mean, I wasn't really that. I was just, I was kind of scrawny actually.
Yeah. So it's, you got sort of body shamed in a different way, it sounds like.
Oh, yes. I did know body shame. That's for sure. But it was more in terms of shape than in terms of weight.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because it sounds like the thin ideal wasn't present. And then also this idea of gaining weight was sort of to further a certain shape. It wasn't like just gain any old weight. It was like,
right. No, gain it in your breasts. and I couldn't seem to do that.
As though that were possible.
Right.
It reminds me a little bit of what's happening right now with sort of mainstream plus size beauty standards and body positivity, where there is this emergence of plus size fashion that all kind of looks in that hourglass shape, and there's sort of a primacy of that's happening now. And some people are heralding that as really radical and it's like erasing the thin ideal, but it kind of is just going back to this like 50s and 60s thing that was happening before Twiggy. It's not really exploding the idea of ideal beauty at all.
Diversity.
Right.
Yeah. And not only that, but the thing that stands out for me, it's still about youth.
Mm.
You see, as an older woman, I'm aware of the kind of bodies that older women have, that nature has decided, you're not going to have the same body as a maiden, and you're not supposed to. And I don't see much of that in the plus size movement.
Definitely not, no. Yeah, it's very much about youth and a certain type of look.
Mm-hmm.
That's super interesting. I want to talk more about that for sure. The sort of beauty standards and an experience of beauty as we age.
Yes. And honestly, one of the reasons why I did get into this was because of that experience in the Miss Universe contest. I was fascinated. I was curious. How did they decide which woman was more beautiful than the other? And there were 65 women from around the world. Back then, they did have very different body shapes. They weren't large, but they certainly weren't tiny. And there was a greater range. But I couldn't help myself. I was just curious. And that began my intrigue, I think, into the whole idea of how people determine what beauty is in the first place. Because I wasn't in it because this was something I went after. I was in it, to do my duty. So I could kind of just be on the sidelines and observe and question about that whole thing.
Yeah, you got to be an anthropologist of this.
It's exactly how it was.
And so did that sort of inspire some of the early feminism that you were
Oh, yes.
delving into? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I was already getting into feminism. So it was a bit of there was some conflict for me. I was not too comfortable with this. But then again, I didn't expect, that I was going to end up in the Miss Universe contest. I thought I was going to do this, lame little, contest. And then I'm off to San Francisco or New York or,
Mm-hmm.
lived on an island my entire life. I wanted at the world.
Right. That must have been so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it sounds like you were able to sort of retain that anthropologist stance and you didn't get really sucked into the whole pursuit of beauty ideals.
I had my moments. And I remember having it to go. I needed somebody to talk to because it was really, at times, really difficult for me. And again, this is back in the day on a little island in the Pacific. There weren't therapists, there weren't counselors. So I went to a priest. And it was interesting what he told me because I felt like I was kind of going crazy a little bit. And he told me, and he just said, Anita, as long as you know who you really are, you're going to be just fine. And I remember that, that really helped me. And he said, this is just a show that you're putting on and it's not who you are. And in some ways that was a little superficial, but not really, because another part of my path has been about consciousness and really getting clear about who we really are. So we start by deciding who we're not. And I was not beauty queen material, that's for sure.
Yeah, despite getting sort of elevated in that world.
Despite all appearances.
Right. So what did you do after Miss Universe?
I got out of Guam and I went to Boulder, Colorado and went to college and finished. I was already a junior. And so I finished school there and got into psychology.
And was that inspired by the feminist studies you had been doing?
That and my curiosity just really about, in some ways, cosmology. Who are we and what are we doing here on the planet in the first place? And so I just had a lot of questions about life and about the psyche. I was more interested, and apparently I have no memory of this, but I reconnected with an old friend. We were friends since we were like 3 years old, 5 years old, and we were talking. She says, Do you remember what you said when we used to talk about what we wanted to be when we grew up? And I went, no, I have no idea. And she said, well, I remember what you said. And I said, what did I say? And she said, you said that you wanted to be a brain doctor because you wanted to see what was going on inside people's brains. And I said, seriously? I said that? She goes, oh, yeah, because I'll never forget the look in your eye. So I'm realizing now, 60 plus years later, that something had been seeded in me in that regard. Mm-hmm. I didn't remember it, but there it was.
Wow.
So I've been more interested in the interior. That has always been more interesting to me.
Yeah. And it sounds like you really sort of knew who you were at a young age as well.
Well, I had to sort down between who I felt I was and who I was told I was. Much of what I was told was fairly encouraging because I was told that I was to follow in my grandmother's footsteps. And that was a good thing because she was quite revered and quite accomplished. And I came from a matrilineal culture. Now there's something different again with lots of strong women who basically took it upon themselves to make the world a better place. And so that was just handed off to me. And I was fairly comfortable with that, I think.
Yeah, that's an incredible gift.
Mm-hmm.
And so different than growing up in a patriarchy.
Yeah, I mean, the patriarchy, had moved in, but there were still remnants. The island was pretty much taken over by the military. That's pretty patriarchal.
Yeah.
And as was the government at that time. So there was a lot of that, but there was still within the indigenous culture, there was still some ties to the it wasn't a matriarchy, but it was matrilineal.
Right. And what's the difference there?
Well, matrilineal is when the mother line is what is passed down in terms of your primary relationships. So the island was occupied for 200 years by the Spanish. So they brought in the patriarchy. Then, so what happened is people adjusted, and when they named their children, they would put the mother's name as the middle name, or sometimes they would keep the mother's name. But by the time the Americans came, which was around the time of the Spanish-American War, they said, no, 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 no. The last name of the children has to be the father's name. So that was like the patriarchy says, okay, this is how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like our way or the highway. That's so fascinating. So what happened after you went to college? You said you got interested and studied psychology.
Studied psychology, and then I went back to Guam, and I lived there for a couple of years. And I thought, well, boy, this is really interesting, psychology. But I realized that in order to make a living doing what I wanted to do, I needed to go back to graduate school. And I had picked psychology because I started off as an art major, hated everything that I did. So I said, okay, we're not doing that. And then I decided, well, I have to declare a major. So let me just do all these required courses. And then when the time came to declare a major, oh, well, what are the courses I liked the most? And I liked English and I liked psychology. And I thought, okay, what can I do with English? Well, I can write or I can teach, or I can write or I can teach. Whereas with psychology, I could write, I could teach, I could do experiments, I could work in hospitals, it just seemed like there were many more things. And since I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, it seemed like it was the better bet to pick the one of the two things I really liked that had more options. And so then I thought, well, you know what? I like this in theory, but what if I don't like working with crazy people? Or what if I don't like listening to people's problems all day long? So I took a job as a counselor, and I loved every minute. I thought, well, isn't this the coolest thing? Every hour, I get to hear a new story. And so since I love stories, it was like, I thought, well, this is great. And that's at the point I decided, okay, back to graduate school, because now I know this is really what I want to do. So I headed to California, and I got a master's in psychology, but I realized the school wasn't preparing me. I found out, oh, you have to take these licensing exams. And although at that first school, I had an incredible teacher who influenced me so profoundly. There was this little old man in front of the room, and he was talking and in a very strong accent, and saying, okay, you need to listen carefully, listen carefully. He's speaking English. You can get this. Well, that little old man turned out to be Viktor Frankl.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he's the psychiatrist that wrote Man's Search for Meaning, created logotherapy as a result of his experience in the concentration camps during World War II. And I was really drawn to some of his stories because my grandfather during World War II, because he was American, my grandmother was not. My grandmother was Chamorro, which are the indigenous people of Guam. Because he was American, he was taken to Japan to a concentration camp, and he died there. So meeting up with Viktor Frankl again, and his message that it's really the meaning that we give to our experience that determines our experience, just really hit me so profoundly, and then has continued. It's influenced me in so many ways because I continue to look for the meaning. What is the meaning I'm giving that, or you're giving that, or they are giving that?
Mm-hmm. That's such a powerful point of view to have, especially around food issues, right?
Yeah, that's how it started, putting two and two together. Because so then I changed schools, ended up having to get a second master's. Like I needed like a hole in my head, and I had a master's in psychology, but that's what was required in order for me to get the PhD. And then, when I was to do my dissertation, and by then I was full-blown feminist, but I was homesick. So I decided to do my dissertation on the ethnic identity of Chamorro women of Guam. So that would take me home for some field work. So I did that. And then I just really started getting immersed in women's issues and women's cultural issues. And after I graduated, I got my doctorate in San Diego. By then, I had met the man who became my husband, but he was from New York City. And he went, well, I'm not living on Guam. And I said, well, I'm not living in New York City. And we took a trip to Hawaii. And I said, look, there's tall buildings and coconut trees here. What do you think? So we moved, we were classmates and we moved to Hawaii at that time. And I was working as a psychologist, and I had a young intern who was working with me, and she was doing her doctoral dissertation on the incidence of eating disorders in Hawaii. And that's how I kind of got into it, trying to figure this out. Now, mind you, we're talking 1980, 81. This is a long time ago. And so not a whole lot had been written. And I would meet with her. And then there was another woman who was a social worker who had recovered from an eating disorder, but she had to figure it all out herself because there was no help available. So the three of us would get together and we would talk and try to figure out, well, what is this and what's going on, and brainstorm. And we kept saying, oh my gosh, there are a lot of people struggling. There needs to be a center for this. And after about the fifth time, probably with a little nudge from my grandmother, we looked at each other and said, well, let's create it. So we called it the Anorexia and Bulimia Center of Hawaii. And it was one of those things you created, and they came from all walks of life, all sizes, all ethnicities, all ages, but all female. Back then, no men were showing up at all. And so I became intrigued because it was like, okay, wait, what's the deal here? First of all, why is it females? Second of all, why is it these girls and women? And third, why is the struggle around food and their bodies? That was the question I just kept asking myself, and I was just so curious about. And so I'm a storyteller. I love stories. And as a psychologist, I'm a trained story listener. So I decided to listen to their stories as carefully as I could to see with all this diversity, and it was really quite diverse, if I could find a common thread. What was the common ground? What was the common denominator that linked all these girls and women into a struggle with their bodies and food? And what I found was this, that they were like the child in the fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. It's a very timely story for today, I think, in some ways. Mm-hmm. But there was once this vain emperor. He didn't care much about ruling his kingdom. He was mostly interested in fine clothing and jewelry. And he had quite a reputation for this. And a couple of con artists heard about him. And so they came into town and they pretended to be tailors. And they said, oh, but our clothing is so fine. Only those fit for their station in life can even see it. Well, this impressed the emperor, so he commissioned a whole new wardrobe for himself. And the con artists, they pretended to cut and stitch clothing that wasn't there, but all the people who worked for the emperor carried on about the fabulous new outfits that they were seeing. And even the emperor himself went on and on and on about his magnificent clothing because he didn't want people to think that he wasn't fit for his station in life, and the others didn't want to lose their jobs. And so eventually, the con artists took the money and they left town laughing all the way to the bank. And now there was this grand procession where the emperor was wearing his new outfit. And all the townspeople were oohing and eyeing about his fabulous clothing because they didn't want to think their neighbor to think they were stupid. But there was a child in the crowd that said in a very loud voice, "But Mommy, the emperor has no clothes on at all." And when this child spoke, it created a ripple throughout the crowd, and everyone saw the emperor for the fool that he was. So what I discovered is that these girls and women were like that child in the crowd, but that their voice had been silenced. So that what I mean by that is that they were very emotionally sensitive and highly intuitive beings. They could see the invisible. They could read between the lines. They could see the bigger picture. They could perceive hypocrisy. They could sense when things were not okay, even when everyone around them said that things were just fine. But because their lives weren't fairy tales, when they spoke the truth, they were either ignored, or they might have been ridiculed or dismissed, or in some cases, abused for speaking the truth. And so they had to find some way to dim their light, to diminish this capacity to perceive very subtle realities. And because what a child wants more than anything else in the world, what all of us want more than anything else in the world, is a sense of belonging. But they confused it with fitting in. And so they decided they had to look like and act like and think like and feel like how they imagined other people wanted them to think and look and act and feel. So you can see how this ties in with eating disorders, because we have a culture that's gotten very clear. This is how you're supposed to look and act and think and feel. And so the way the struggle with food came in is that became their obsession, because they thought there was something wrong with them. And the more they fought with it, the worse it got, until they found their voice. They stayed entangled in it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a powerful metaphor for what we go through with eating issues, because so many people, I'm sure, listening can identify as those children in the crowd, and that part of your book just spoke to me so strongly too, because I feel like I've always been that person as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not safe sometimes.
No. And so it wasn't such a bad idea, actually, to create an eating disorder, given the limited resources and support that was available back then. But it's also, here's the interesting thing, because sometimes the wounding is the gift. And what I have, I've been working in the field now 35 years. I've seen lots and lots and lots of people recover from an eating disorder and break free from the dieting madness. I get letters from around the world. I get emails, people telling me, how they're celebrating their lives and how, it's been transformed. So I believe this with every fiber in my being, that those that have struggled with eating and body image issues and yo-yo dieting or full-blown eating disorders or whatever it happens to be, and recover and break free, they're the people the world has been waiting for. Because we need those that can see those more subtle realities, that aren't so locked up in the literal way of perceiving things that our culture is telling us that we need to have. They're the ones that can speak the truth in ways that the child in this fairy tale did, in ways so that people can hear it and things can be transformed.
Yes. Oh, that's so beautifully said. And it makes me think too of the idea that, dieting is a way to keep people from stepping into their power, to keep people playing small, right?
Oh, yes. Yes. And binging is a way of stuffing your voice, and restricting is a way of restricting your voice, and obsessing is a way of distracting your thoughts so you can't imagine a better world.
Mm-hmm. This idea of adaptive, disordered eating and eating disorders being adaptive has been so influential in the field. And I think it started with this idea that you put out there in that book that, we really needed those behaviors at some point in life, right? Because it was so unsafe.
Well, and we didn't have the skills, and we didn't have anyone to teach us the skills. So one of the things that I believe very strongly is so important. In fact, I've never seen anyone fully, completely, 100% recover without this, which is assertive communication, finding your voice, speaking the truth. It's amazing what that does for the individual as well as for the community.
Yeah, I feel like I've experienced that with this podcast very much.
You are doing it, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you're one of those.
Right. I'm one of those. It was sort of a semi-conscious decision, I think, when I was recovering, because I was at the final stages of my behavioral recovery from my eating disorder when I decided to start the podcast. But it had, for so many people, the behaviors sometimes will shift into another area of life. And for me, they had shifted into codependent relationships and trying to caretake and fix people who, didn't want or need my help in that way. And I remember sort of banging my head against the wall with this one guy I was seeing who had a lot of narcissistic qualities. And I was like, why do I keep being attracted to these narcissists? What is it with me? And I sort of realized it through therapy and talking with friends and just processing on my own that my own narcissistic side, because we all have those qualities, right, had been so dampened and it was so lacking. My ability to speak out and to take the spotlight and to share my voice, I was locating all of that in these men, and I was not doing it for myself.
Yes. And that's the thing, is that you start to see that the disordered eating, whatever form it takes, is a form of communication, but it's distorted. It's not pure and direct. And once you get to see the metaphoric nature of it all, which is why I work with, even food metaphor, the food itself that you happen to be struggling with, that maybe you have a yes, no, yes, no, yes, no relationship. It can, if you look at it metaphorically, it can reveal to you other areas in your life where there are conflicts that you haven't quite yet figured out how to resolve, and then can point you towards what that might be. So the idea that the struggle itself is metaphoric, and it is a communication once you can crack the code. But unfortunately, it's a coded communication. And getting to what the real issues are require being able to shift away from a super duper literal way of thinking and seeing things.
Yeah, which takes a lot of bravery, I think, to be able to investigate your own mind like that.
Yeah, it can be a little scary because a lot of people go, "Oh, I don't want to look at myself. What if I don't like who I am?" That's a typical thing that I hear. And so it does take some courage, but it's not, in my experience, it's not just like crawling over cut glass on your bare knees. There is some joy in it, and that's what makes it worthwhile, and that's why I think people continue. And so one of the things I do is just help people look at the metaphors of the foods they happen to be struggling with, and begin with that. Begin with what the struggle is, and then you can start to broaden your vision and start to see all sorts of other things, and then really stand in your capacity to see the invisible, read between the lines, see the bigger picture, and then know that to be true.
Yes. I think it's so important to know that that's okay as well, to have permission to read between the lines, because as you've described, it's really unsafe in some families to do that because of the consequences. And if, even if you're an adult, even if it's decades later, that way of relating to people is still so ingrained, and it can still feel so terribly unsafe to speak those truths.
Right. That's why finding community with your kindred spirits is so important. What you're doing is really important, where people can tap into a community that has different values and can support and respect what it is that someone might be experiencing. It's why I created the Light of the Moon Cafe. It's an online community. We have a forum where people continually support each other in breaking free of the struggle in a non-dieting way. So, I think more and more and more we're seeing, hopefully it's like mushrooms, they'll be popping up everywhere, that there will be places of respite, essentially, and support for speaking your truth and knowing what you know, and honoring your emotions and your intuitions and your instincts as a vital part of who you are.
That's so valuable to have community. I think that's such a great point, because we're surrounded by diet culture, right? We live in diet culture. And so if your, inner voice is starting to speak to you and say, like, this restrictive way of eating or this disordered way of eating isn't working for me. And then you have all these people in your Facebook feed being like, try this Whole30, or, this is making me feel amazing. And it's like, it's sort of recreating almost the trauma that one might have experienced in a family that didn't allow them to speak their truth or feel their feelings, right?
Right. And that's why I think with Facebook, it can be a great community, but we have to remember we're in charge of who shows up. You can block somebody, you can, make some choices about whose voices you're going to be listening to.
Yeah. And it's super important to do that, I think.
I think so. It's a modern day skill.
hmm Which that actually sort of reminds me of something in the book about that you described about boundaries and sort of this like masculine and feminine energy around tapping into your intuition, but also having what's, traditionally termed like a masculine type of skill
Yeah.
of setting boundaries and creating limits and protecting yourself. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little more about that.
Well, you need both. And it's tricky with the language because it sounds like we're talking about genders, and we're not. We're talking about principles that exist in all of us, regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender or whatever. And in Asian cultures, they call it yin and yang. I use the terms masculine and feminine because I come out of the Jungian tradition. And the reason why they use those words is they do a lot of dream work. And those energies show up in our dreams in the form of males and females. So it's a little tricky, but I think the idea that you need to create a container within your psyche to hold your feelings, your feminine side, so that it's not spilling out all over the place, but also to protect you from the nonsense of others. There's a lot of nonsense out there in the world. And so everybody talks about the inner child. And at the Light of the Moon Cafe, we work a lot with the inner parents. How do you create an inner mother that is exactly the mother you always wanted, that gives you what you want, when you want, as much as you want, and none of the stuff you don't want, and that kind of nurture and comfort, and an inner father that provides security and protection so that you move safely through the world and not have to isolate. You can build boundaries and not walls. And so that's when you move away from a more literal way of thinking and start to work with energies that are available to you in your own psyche.
I love that. I think that's been, for me in my healing journey, I think that was such a huge aspect of it, was sort of reparenting myself, learning how to connect with the inner child in a more compassionate way and be that voice for myself that I would have wanted, rather than the critical or harried or, doesn't have any time for me kind of voice that maybe I, absorbed growing up.
And I think it's our job actually, because when I look at it, nobody ever got the perfect parents. Some scored better than others, perhaps. But for all of us, we've had the experience of, not having the parents that gave us what we wanted and didn't give us what we didn't want. And when I think about it, because I can't help myself, I'm real curious about these things. Well, why in the world is that? Whose idea was that, right? We end up here on this planet, and then, we get these folks trying as best they can, or maybe not even trying, who knows? But wait, why does this happen to everybody? It's archetypal. It means it crosses all culture and all time. And so to me, if it's archetypal, then maybe it's supposed to be that way. But wait, if it's supposed to be that way, why is it supposed to be that way? And the best I've been able to come up with is so that we can create that within ourselves. And I know I'm a little dated here, but in the days before digital photos, you had negatives out of which you created the photograph. And so one of the things that we do this in the cafe, we have people take a look at the things you wished you could have gotten and didn't get. And now how can you be that voice for yourself? How can you create that for yourself?
I love that. And yeah, it's sort of a gift in a way to have something come up in your life that has to point you to that awareness, and to be able to see like, I didn't get this and I want it, and that's okay. That's not bad. Like that's actually pointing me in the direction of what's going to serve me.
If I understand it in that way. See, that's the thing. You have to kind of flip out of and shift your perspective a little bit in order to see that.
Right. And sort of, I think that's such a hard cycle to break when you're caught in self-criticism. And of course, disordered eating and dieting just exacerbates that, because then not only do you have the sort of insight that you're not letting yourself see, or that's too frightening to see, but also you have this symptom, these symptoms or these problems that you're doing that are causing issues in your life in other ways.
Right.
It's kind of blocking you even further from getting to the thing you really want.
If you can understand these issues are showing up in order to get your attention, then you can start to begin to get curious. And I call it compassionate curiosity. I wonder why I'm struggling with this, rather than, Why do I have to struggle with this? It's like, well, I wonder why. What's it about? How would I like it to be different? Not why can't I be different, but how would I like it to, you see, at least there's a saying, don't get stuck looking at the finger pointing to the moon. Look at the moon.
Yeah. I think of my cat whenever I try to point something out to him. He's just looking at
Is
my
there
finger.
a tree? Is there a tree on that finger? Because it's symbolic. You see, when you point, it's symbolic. And the struggle, if you can look at it as something that's pointing you towards something else.
I love that. You mentioned the moon, and I'm curious about the concept of the light of the moon, if you can sort of elucidate that a little bit, because I love what it represents.
It represents the feminine principle in many, many, many cultures around the planet for eons. And so I use that metaphorically, eating in the light of the moon, to bring in the feminine, which has been banished in our culture, or certainly it's been a little cockeyed because of the patriarchal culture we live in. The masculine aspect of ourselves and the culture, the logical, linear, goal, achievement-oriented side of ourselves, dominates the feminine, which is the emotional, the instinctual, the intuitive, and the relational. The feminine is concerned about the relationship among all things. And so I just bring in that concept of the feminine metaphorically, so that it's through that lens and through strengthening that we find balance. Nothing's wrong with the masculine side, by the way. I wouldn't have gotten through school without it, but it has to be in balance.
And our culture so overemphasizes that side, right? The
So
logical,
cockeyed. Yeah.
achievement-oriented side, which, does really serve us in certain areas of life. But I think we can't just depend on that.
Right.
And exclusively depending on it is a problem. It's interesting when you're talking about, the balance of masculine and feminine principles, or of that sort of emotive versus logical side. Like, I feel like a lot of what I see people getting stuck with, and certainly what I got stuck with too, was like not having enough of the boundaried, protective side, but also not having enough of the emotive, sort of intuitive side, or not allowing myself access to that side.
Right.
And having just sort of an overarching, like all there was achievement, logic, structure, following the rules, right?
Right. I look at it metaphorically. The image that comes to me is the feminine is the container that holds our deepest truths, the essence of who we are. And our masculine is the vehicle that takes that out into the world. So you need both.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've only developed the feminine and not the masculine, you'll have all kinds of dreams and visions and wonderful ideas, and nothing will ever happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if you only develop the masculine, you'll get all kinds of things done. You'll have all this money in the bank and letters after your name, and your life will feel meaningless, as though you took the ladder and climbed it and realized, oh, wrong wall.
Totally. Yeah. Not connected to the true desire underneath that.
Right.
Yeah, that's been a dance in my own life too, of being fully recovered and having to look at those issues that were coming up in my life in that arena, the arena of food and the arena of relationships. But of course, they just keep emerging in different areas, right? And they keep sort of showing up, even if one area is quiet, there's some other things that are emerging. So definitely the sort of like letters after your name, accolades, numbers, download numbers. I shared on the podcast recently that I've been obsessing about those. And, it's good. It's like good things are happening. Mm-hmm. So there's a sort of desire to like celebrate that. But there's also this feeling that does feel kind of familiar from the dieting and disordered eating days of like, well, how do I get this thing that's, the new goal out in front of, and it needs to be tempered by that more present and relational and emotive side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always a balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's how life is, I think. And our balance point really isn't stationary. There's always a little wiggle going on there.
Yeah, we're always changing throughout our lives. It's true.
Mm-hmm.
So how have you found is helpful to navigate that in your own life? What are some practices or tools you use?
Well, there's a few things. Number one, I won't open my eyes in the morning when I wake up until I have put myself in a state of well-being. Then I will meditate a little bit. and go dance or go to my Pilates class. And only then do I look at my emails after that.
Mm, that's a very good strategy.
Yeah, I found it's essential, actually.
I'm really I took the first step by not having my phone charger on the side table right by my bed. It's on the desk across the room. But oftentimes the first thing I do is get up and go to the desk across the room and look at my phone.
Yeah,
So it's,
it's very difficult because those devices have been developed with full knowledge of how they affect our brains. And so it's real easy to get addicted because they know what they're doing.
Yeah. That's a really good point. They're sort of preying on this.
It's all calculated.
And the desire for belonging, right? I feel like that's so.
Oh, see, that's the thing, because the difference is that we all have this hunger to belong, but to belong is when you connect with another while you stay connected to self. Fitting in is when you abandon yourself in order to connect with another.
I love that distinction. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, that's something that, I've seen a lot of people struggle with in trying to eat intuitively in groups of people, right? But it can translate into so many aspects of your life, right? Acknowledging your own hunger, your own desires, even when everybody else is ordering a salad and you want the burger,
Exactly. And the problem is when you disconnect from self, that increases the hunger to belong, and it gets even worse. And so by fitting in, you make yourself even hungrier for belonging. And it's endless.
Yeah. That is really a good tip. Like, stop trying to fit in and you'll actually belong more.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, tell us a little more about the Light of the Moon Cafe and also your book, Eating in the Light of the Moon, which that's based on.
Well, Eating in the Light of the Moon is folktales and fairy tales from around the world, where I use storytelling and metaphor to help people stop thinking in such a literal way about their experience, because I basically take them into the other side of their brain. And that's where you can start to make new connections and a new way of understanding. And so for years, people had been asking me for a workbook for Eating the Light of the Moon. And every time I thought about it, my inner feminine said, "Oh, how boring." So she couldn't get my masculine on board to do it. But then I came up with this idea of an interactive workbook. And it was through a conversation with my friend and colleague, Elizabeth Peterson, who had been running Eating in the Light of the Moon support groups. And I've been doing soul hunger workshops around the country. And she said, "Anita, do you think it's possible to create this online?" And I went, "Wow, I have no idea. Let's try." So we did. And so we created the Light of the Moon Cafe, which is an online interactive so-called workbook for Eating in the Light of the Moon, but it's run like a course as well as a woman's support circle. So every day, there's several modules, but for 8 weeks, every day, a participant will get something in their email, whether it'll be something as simple as, "Oh, this week we're reading chapter 7 and Eating the Light of the Moon." And then the next day will be an audio of me telling that story and interpreting it. And then the next day might be a poem about that concept. And the next day would be a downloadable PDF with questions to help you personalize it more. And then the next day will be another audio of a metaphor. And then there'll be a drawing or writing activity. And then there's a playlist of songs to listen to. And every single day there's something. And then there's a forum, and everyone hops on the forum if they want to. And I'm on there every day communicating back to people about whatever came up for them. So it's structured, and yet at the same time, there's room for discussion. There's only one rule, which is only support, no advice, and nobody's ever broken it. We've been doing this for 5 years now. And it's really, really, and we have 3 live calls where we get on the phone and I answer questions that people have and just talk more about the material. And it's really been the joy of my life, actually. I really, really love doing it. And in fact, if any of your listeners are interested, I have a free gift that you can get a little tiny taste of the type of thing we do with metaphor and how to find, for example, the foods you struggle with, how to find the metaphors in that. And you can go to lightofthemooncafe.com/FP. So that's something. FP stands for food psych.
Oh, exciting.
But it's really been incredible for me it's a way I get to communicate with a lot of people and get their feedback about their journey. I really enjoy it.
Oh, that's so great. I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes so people can go check it out. Well, thank you so much, Anita. It's been wonderful talking with you.
You are so welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. And I so appreciate what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot. So that's our show. Thanks again so much to our guests for being here and to you guys for listening. And we'll be back again next week with another brand new episode. Meanwhile, I'd love to stay in touch. And the best way to do that is via email. So you can go to christyharrison.com/email to sign up for my VIP list. I'll send you info about new episodes of the podcast as they drop, as well as exclusive sneak previews of new episodes, giveaways and other special deals on the products and services I offer, special tips on how to make peace with food and learn to trust your body, and a whole lot more. Sign up at christyharrison.com/email. You can also subscribe via iTunes and leave us a nice rating and review, which is a great way to get the word out about the podcast and help other people find these important messages. Just go to iTunes from your computer or your podcasts app, type in Food Psych to the search bar, click on the result that comes up under podcasts, and then click on ratings and reviews, and you can leave a rating and review right there. And I really appreciate all the 5-star reviews and wonderful ratings that we've gotten because it's helped us climb really high right now in the rankings. And that's really cool because we're competing against some of the weight management and body shaming types of messages that I'm trying to fight with this podcast. So we've really started to beat out a lot of the diety voices, and I'd love to continue climbing higher in the rankings to get this message out even further. So please leave us a nice rating and review. It's so very much appreciated, and thanks to everyone who's left reviews so far. The music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now.